There is an archipelago in the middle of the North Atlantic that most world maps simply leave out, not because of a cartographic error. Because of its scale, 18 islands totaling about 100 square kilometers disappear into the ocean whenever a map needs to show entire continents. This geographic invisibility is the first clue to what you are about to discover here. A place that the modern world took a long time to reach, and when it finally did, it found something it wasn't expecting. Beauty shaped by geological violence, silence shaped by isolation, and a culture that survived for centuries of ocean and wind because it learned not to fight either of them. The Faroe Islands lie between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland, almost equidistant from all three, yet belonging to none of them in spirit, although politically they are under the Danish crown. The name comes from the Old Norse Farojar, meaning sheep islands. Not islands of mountains, not of the ocean, not of the cliffs that rise as high as 754 meters straight out of the sea. Because when the first Norse settlers arrived in the 9th century, what they found on solid ground was not human resistance, it was wool. Today, there are 80,000 sheep for just 53,000 inhabitants. That ratio is not tourist folklore, it is official census data, and it explains something fundamental about how this landscape was shaped. Centuries of highland grazing transformed what would otherwise have been forested slopes into open fields of intensely green grass, combed by the wind into continuous waves. The landscape you see in photographs, that vivid green spread across black basalt above the gray ocean, is partly the result of thousands of years of sheep eating nearly everything that tried to grow taller than 30 centimeters. Geology did the rest. The island of Vágar is where most visitors set foot in the Faroe Islands for the first time. But what lies hidden within it is what truly justifies the journey. Lake Sørvágsvatn, also known as Leitisvatn, depending on which nearby village you ask, is one of the most astonishing optical illusions in all of Europe. The lake sits about 30 meters above sea level, separated from the ocean by a narrow strip of land and towering cliffs. But when viewed from a particular angle from a promontory to the east, the illusion is complete and deeply unsettling. The lake appears to be suspended above the ocean, floating in the air over the waves, as though gravity had decided that in this one place, it would work differently. It is not a photographic trick, it is geometry and perspective. The promontory from which the lake is viewed sits at a lower elevation than the lake itself, and the strip of land between the two disappears from the line of sight. The result is one of the most genuinely surreal images nature has ever created without any human intervention. The island of Streymoy is the largest of the Faroe Islands, and in its northern interior lies a landscape that seems to have come from a mythology that has yet to be written. The valley of Saxun opens between mist-covered mountains with a gentleness that contrasts sharply with the ruggedness of everything around it. At the bottom of the valley, a tidal lagoon connected to the ocean by a narrow channel fills and empties with the tides, changing its color and size twice each day. The village along its shores has only a few dozen houses, all with grass roofs, all facing the water, as if the lagoon were the center of the world. And here, in a way, it is. The grass on the rooftops is not decoration. It is thermal insulation. It is weight that helps keep the structures anchored against the wind. It is a solution that the first inhabitants developed centuries ago because it was what the land provided. Over time, it became part of their identity. The Faroe Islands' grass-roofed houses are now among the most recognizable images of the archipelago, but their origin is entirely practical, born from necessity, and from a careful understanding of what the land could offer. The mountains surrounding Saxon rise abruptly from the valley floor and disappear into the mist before their summits can be seen. On clear days, the peaks reveal a landscape of grassy plateaus where sheep graze close to the edges of cliffs that plunge directly into the ocean. The Faroe Islands have more sheep than people, a ratio that says something about the relationship between this place and the animals that learned to thrive here. At the northernmost edge of the archipelago, where the islands end and the Atlantic begins its uninterrupted march toward the Arctic, the landscape reaches its most dramatic form. The island of Eneberg is home to the highest sea cliffs in Europe. Rising 754 meters above the ocean, they do not climb gradually. They simply exist vertical and absolute, as if the ocean had encountered a boundary it had decided to respect. Seen from below, from a slowly approaching boat, they hardly seem real. Their scale is too immense for the human eye to process without hesitation. The brain searches for familiar points of reference and finds none that are adequate. At the top of the cliffs, where the rock meets the grass, the world changes completely. The wind here does not merely blow, it pushes with purpose, as though it is constantly testing everything that chooses to remain. The grass grows low and dense, permanently bent toward the island's interior, sculpted by the wind into a permanent slope that is, at the same time, a mark of endurance. An adaptation. The wildflowers that manage to grow in this environment are small, compact, and pressed close to the ground. These are the forms that evolution found to survive in a place where growing tall is a vulnerability. And then, at the edge, comes the abyss. There is no transition. The grass ends, and the ocean begins 754 meters below. From up here, the waves appear almost motionless, yet at sea level they crash against the base of the cliffs with a force that echoes through the entire rock face like a slow, deep heartbeat. Between the islands of Vágar and Streymoy, the ocean has created something that should not exist. The Faroe Islands are filled with small islets, rocky outcrops, and formations that rise unexpectedly from the sea. But Drangarnir is different. It consists of two towering basalt sea stacks rising from the ocean. The larger stands about 70 meters high, with natural openings carved by erosion that allow you to see the ocean through the rock itself. Behind them, The island of Tindhólmur rises with 5 jagged peaks reaching into the sky like the fingers of a clenched hand, each with a different shape, each casting a different shadow across the water depending on the time of day. The entire composition, the sea stacks in the foreground, the sharply cut island behind them, and the gray ocean between, is one of the most recognizable silhouettes in the North Atlantic. But no photograph can reproduce what is missing from the image. The sound, the wind passing through the openings in the sea stacks creates a continuous tone that changes pitch with every gust. The waves breaking against the rocks below add an irregular rhythm beneath it. The Faroe Islands are one of the most important breeding grounds for seabirds in the North Atlantic. Millions of birds arrive every spring to nest on the cliffs. Auks, geese, northern gannets, divers, and guillemots. But no bird has captured the imagination of the islanders quite like the puffin. With its brightly colored orange and yellow beak, gray-ringed eyes, and body that seems far too small for the immense landscape it inhabits, the puffin looks almost like one of nature's comic mistakes. It is a bird that flies with obvious effort, lands with unforgettable awkwardness, stands on the cliff edges wearing an expression that humans almost always interpret as worry, and then transforms completely beneath the water. They arrive in April and leave in August. During those months, the cliffs of the Faroe Islands become filled with life and sound in a way that the rest of the year gives no hint of. The island of Kalsoy is long, narrow, and almost entirely mountainous. It has few inhabitants, few roads, and a lighthouse at its northern tip that is one of the most remote and quiet places in all of inhabited Europe. The Kalur lighthouse is not large. It is not especially old. It has no dramatic history of shipwrecks or heroic rescues. What it does have is its location. It stands on top of a cliff, projecting out over the ocean, with the mountains of Kalsoy behind it and the open Atlantic stretching endlessly ahead. On clear days, it is possible to see other islands of the archipelago scattered across the ocean in every direction. Dark, irregular shapes rising from the sea with the unmistakable improbability that defines everything about the Faroe Islands. On foggy days, the lighthouse stands alone in a world reduced to only a few meters of visibility in every direction. The grass, the rock, and the lighthouse beam flashing through the dense white fog. The trail leading to the lighthouse crosses hillsides, where the grass is broken by outcrops of black basalt. The contrast between the vivid green and the deep black of the rock is one of the Faroe Islands' most constant visual features, a color palette that seems limited, yet under the right light reveals a complexity of shades that no description can fully capture. Along the way, sheep graze without showing the slightest interest in visitors. They have lived here for centuries, descendants of the animals brought by the first Norse settlers in the 9th century. In many ways, they are the creatures that understand the geography of the Faroe Islands better than any other living being that inhabits them. There is a time of day in the Faroe Islands that exists nowhere else in quite the same way. During the summer, when the days stretch for more than 19 hours, the sun never fully sets. It touches the horizon, hesitates, and begins to rise again. During that brief hesitation, the sunlight passes almost horizontally through the atmosphere above the ocean, taking on a golden quality that transforms everything it touches. The cliffs grow darker, in contrast to the illuminated sky. The green grass takes on the color of aged gold. The ocean, normally gray or cold blue, turns the color of copper. It is what photographers call the golden hour. But in the Faroe Islands, it lasts for hours rather than minutes. And it unfolds across a landscape that needs no special light to be extraordinary. With that light, it becomes something that language can only partially describe. In winter, the opposite happens. The days have fewer than 6 hours of daylight, and the sun never climbs very high above the horizon. The light remains low throughout the day, casting long shadows even at noon and revealing textures in the rock and grass that summer conceals. The ocean becomes darker, heavier. Storms arrive more often and with greater force. The archipelago reveals its most austere, its most honest character. Those who have experienced it in both seasons often say that the Faroe Islands are not a destination for those seeking comfort or predictability. The weather changes 4 times in a single day. The wind cancels your plans without apology. The fog swallows landscapes that were visible only moments before. And the ocean always present. Since nowhere in the archipelago is more than 5 kilometers from the sea, constantly reminds you that this is a place that exists according to its own rules, rules established long before any human presence, and rules that will continue long after humanity is gone. And that is precisely what makes the Faroe Islands irreplaceable. In a world where nature is increasingly filtered, explained, signposted, and made safe for consumption, this archipelago remains authentic, not as a matter of image or deliberate preservation, but simply as the result of standing in the middle of the North Atlantic, exposed to everything the ocean and the wind have to offer, without enough shelter to pretend that nature is merely decorative. Here, nature is structural. It is the ground, the roof, the air, the sound. It is what existed before, and what will remain afterward. The Atlantic crashes against the cliffs, the rock endures, and above it all, the wind never stops passing, carrying mist, carrying salt, carrying the scent of an ocean whose opposite shore cannot be seen, toward an interior that, over centuries, has learned to receive all of it without ever breaking completely. It simply bends like the grass. It simply endures like the basalt. It simply continues, like the islands themselves,